assorted things like that to temporarily free up bandwidth. You know.
Well, we're live because I'm doing it just from my phone.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, that's the issue with the apples. You'll you know they'll work themselves out though. Hopefully, I think check the updates too. The updates come in, and it might be a Riverside update issue as well.
Yeah,
But
I think
yes,
it's just
indeed,
my 5-year-old computer update issue,
for sure.
which is no good. But like you said, I'm
To give an
eventually just going to
example,
move on to. I like the Apple phone and computer because of
right?
AirDrop, and it's just so easy to move things between them. And then Laura's phone, my phone, it keeps
Exactly.
the quality.
I'm not going to
But
bullshit one iota. There's features, software in Apple that are just phenomenal, and that's why people go to them. I mean, there's a reason why they are where that, and that's because they're just features like that that are just airdrops and all kinds of stuff like that that are really awesome. And there's no real equivalent exactly on PC. There's ones that imitate it, and you could set it up to do it like it, but nothing as easy and as smooth a setup as logging into 2 Apple devices and then swapping shit between them. It's just smooth as butter. So that is something really cool about Apple devices. But to give you an idea with the PC, and another thing is too is you have to learn a whole new software operating system on both the phone and the PC. So once a lot of times when people get going one direction, they stay that direction. Not to say that you can't, and it's not. It's certainly not. It's easier than it ever was, especially back in the '90s. They were like way different, so it was much more difficult. But they've blended somewhat in terms of their operating systems, and they do similar features. So you'll be surprised how easy you'll be able to pick it up, and how easy I pick up the Mac stuff. But the difference is really with the hardware. They really make the hardware difficult to upgrade, change, swap out, etc. And in return, you get this great software environment that doesn't have any conflicts or anything. But what I've done for years is I have like a core PC, a good CPU, and a good motherboard. And then the other parts, the SSDs, the GPUs, I just swap them out over time. And I can keep that core for a good, I keep it for 10 years. I have a 10-year plan basically with my CPU and motherboard, and then I swap it out every 10 years. But otherwise, the GPUs, they need upgrades more often. And the SSDs are your hard drives basically, and those get full, and the files get bigger all the time. So I often get a bigger, especially like recently, the memory prices were on sale, so I bought some sick SSDs, and that's just one of those things where like if you have a 2 terabyte in your computer, your Mac computer, but you want a 4 terabyte, you either have to send it in and pay all this like warranty refresh fees, or if you're out of warranty, the repair fees. And with me, I just literally went on Amazon and bought the 4 terabyte and swapped it in the computer, and everything worked fine. So it's that kind of stuff that really helps a lot. You get a core base of your build, and then you can just add and swap parts to your build. Makes it just super, super nice as a tech person. And really, the swapping of the SSDs and stuff, they call it like Legos for adults. It's not complicated. It's really easy. So. It's definitely something to consider on your next buy, on your next software build for sure.
I'm gonna have you help me build a PC.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have you help me build a PC. Certain things that I prefer to do. There's certain things than other things. So that's where you can come in and be like, help me actually build out a PC. Which is so cool about PCs is that you can customize them. Which is so cool about PCs is that you can customize them.
Yes, exactly. That's a compartmentalize them how you want them. I just did a build for Jen and Kian, and they had specific requirements. They want to do some basic 3D modeling and some gaming. And so I was able to build a really sick setup for them just specific to that. But if you want to do video editing and other stuff, that has a different set of hardware that is better for that. So, you can build a build just for that.
No, that is cool. That is so. Cool. What else has been going on with you? What interesting things have you been seeing on the Twitterverse, or have you been seeing on the or anything Twitterverse or?
Yeah, well, of course, the big thing in some circles is the Epstein documents are finally getting released. So you're seeing for the first time a list of who was all at the island, and this is just a high level list. It's not even a comprehensive list. It's just whoever they were able to catch through the net, essentially. And yeah, it should be real interesting. I don't expect too many surprises. Some people do, but I expect some a few surprises, but nothing too crazy. But yeah, I just been practicing my cooking. Actually, I've been trying to focus on being a better cook, so I've been focused on that. But in terms of politics stuff, yeah, I've been looking at the Epstein stuff. There was a big bombing in Iran. That's interesting. ISIS claimed it, as well as the scientific advancements for this year of last year. There's been lots of videos on that, and both in astronomy and in other fields. It was a pretty impressive year, actually.
I want to go into the Iran bombing.
They don't show that.
I saw a little thing on Iran bombing on Twitter.
I saw a little thing on it
or on X
on Twitter.
But I don't know anything about it.
I don't know anything about it.
Under the Trump administration, we took out Stalin, and he was basically the Republican Guard. The Republican Guard is like the elite military force. It's of the Iranian military forces, and they basically he was like one of the generals of the Republican Guard. And basically, these guys, it's weird because the new function of militaries in the Middle East and Africa and stuff is that they also start to accumulate businesses and economic powers within the country. So, like Egypt, their military actually has like tons of corporations that they own and control. And in our country, there's actually very clear constitutional limits on those things, on what generals can own and stuff, while they're also officers in the United States Army. But in those other countries, those aren't clear cut. And so you can blend those two. So imagine if you're a top general, you can also coerce people into signing over corporations or ownership parts and eventually acquiring these companies. That's what a lot of Egypt's generals have done over the decades. And Iran has taken to a whole nother level because they have the religious establishment backing the Republican Guard. And so they basically own like massive, powerful corporations in Iran as well. So it's like if the army owned a lot of the apples as well. So they're like almost undefeatable. And Soleiman was known for both connecting the companies as well as the military side. And he also was spreading those militias, Shia militias all throughout the Middle East, from Syria to Iraq to Iran. It's called the Crescent Arc, I believe they call it, or something like that. And it's like from Syria to Iraq to Iran. And that's where the Shia militias have spread. And he was a big strategic leader of those. And those have caused trouble and American deaths, both in the Iraq war for us. Those militias caused casualties for Americans in the Iraq war, as well as in Syria with the Syria civil war that caused hella chaos. Those Shia militias were causing havoc as well. Hezbollah is one of the most biggest known backers of Iranian Shia militia groups, and Soleiman has many meetings with Hezbollah leaders and has handshake footage of him with all these guys. So under the Trump administration, because of the troubles his plans had caused us, they drone striked him. They actually completely just extra legally targeted him, and like Osama bin Laden type thing, they just totally took him out. I believe it was in Iraq, and it was just like a street in Iraq, and they just did an American drone strike and took him out in a car. So anyways, he has now a big, of course, Iran went all out, and they had this big tomb built for him, and he's a big a hero of the revolution, and et cetera, et cetera. So he's all this big thing. And so at the celebrations for Soleiman, that's where this happened, and everyone was having a big meet and greet at Soleiman's tomb. And the thing that's interesting about it is those Shiite militias, yes, they were targeting Western and American forces, but what are the two branches in Islam? Sunni and Shia, right? And ISIS is Sunni, and is basically often refers to the Shia as like heretics or other degrading things. And so the Shia militias attacking the Sunnis, they definitely caused casualties for the Sunnis. And so the ISIS detonated a bomb for the Suleiman Shia at their event. That's what basically is so far has come out about it. Is ISIS was striking back. The Sunni ISIS was striking back on them.
If it had to do with the Sunni and
that's what I was going to
Shiites.
If it had to do with the Sunni and Shiites.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, but you answered that one.
My next question, but you answered that one.
Yeah, that's what underlies it. That's what underlies it. You know, Iran, of course, first blamed Israel because of what's going on, as well as America. And also, America did kill Suleiman. So, you know, there is that underlying. But when America did it, they also didn't hide it or just say they weren't involved with it. So if America was involved with it, which attacking civilians is usually not the MO, you know, I think they would own up to it, or at least, you know, have some evidence leading towards it. It seems at this point everyone's kind of agreed that it's ISIS, and you know, there's a little bit of Sunni in Iran, and of course they're like a minority that's very oppressed. So they're like an oppressed minority in the country, and so any Sunnis they could find, and even people who compose as Shia, they were able to get close enough to the events to set off some remote detonated bombs in the festivities. There's footage of it, and you could see like some bombs go off and everybody's running and screaming and everything. But it's pretty crazy, and it's par for the course in this Sunni Shia. I've seen this since before America invaded Iraq. This was happening, and before anybody America saw on the radar, this was already happening between them out there on their own, and it will continue to happen long after we're not even there anymore. So that's like a Muslim thing, a specifically Muslim thing.
Who was the president of Iraq?
Who was the president
before 9/11?
Iraq before 9/11?
Saddam.
Oh,
so when people were
Saddam,
saying that Saddam was committing
so
genocide against his own people, that was another instance where it was actually the Sunnis and the Shiites.
The Sunnis and the Shiites.
Yeah, exactly. Sunnis are the minority in Iraq. The Shia actually make up the majority, and it was like, what if Saddam, who is a Sunni, got in power and then oppressed all the majority of the country, and he did it by total violence and kept them all in check by just pure violence, because they were totally outnumbered, and they had to. That's often when you see countries act like this, is because they're the tribe that's against them is the majority, and the only way to hold them down, at least they think, is to be as ruthless as possible. It does work sometimes, and other times it doesn't. You know, so but in Saddam's case, it actually had nothing to do with less like ISIS, like religious dogma. It had more to do with Sunni Shia tribal dogma than that. The party he was involved with, I'm trying to think of the party he was in. They were actually considered more like closer to fascists than like a religious Al-Qaeda ISIS-based group.
Gotcha.
What was the name of Saddam's group? Let me see. Saddam's Hussein's political group. They had followers in all over the Middle East, and they were part. Baathism. Yes. So you might have read before, like Baathism. It was like an Arab. It was basically like Arab nationalism, and so kind of like Nazis was German nationalism, right? So the Arab nationalism was like Arab nationalists, but these were like extreme nationalists. So they were actually much more secular and non-religious, and that's why, ironically, Saddam was actually one of the biggest prosecutors of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And ISIS didn't exist back then, but Al-Qaeda, the Salafi group, religious. So the people who have grown since he was removed in Iraq, he actually suppressed more than anybody because he was more of an Arab nationalist, like a German nationalist. And just like the Nazis suppressed Catholicism in the country, they kept religion under control, and so did the Ba'athist Party. So ironically, by removing Saddam, we created a whole plethora of the religious side of the groups to expand. They were always there, and they have been for 1,000 years. But ironically, by removing him, we allowed it to really take off, and that was a big problem for us ever since.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, that is for sure. What's up, dude?
All things considered, I have never understood exactly. I can't ever really get to a point of justifying why we removed Saddam. You can't help but think it's just related to Bush Sr. Finally finishing the job from the first Gulf War. But that is a really stupid fucking reason to do what we did in the second 2003 Gulf War, because basically he was in a lot of ways a counterweight to all the problems that we have to deal with in the Middle East now. He acted as a counterweight to them, and by removing that counterweight, we've essentially multiplied our problems instead. And I just really can't justify why he certainly had nothing to do with 9/11. That's been conclusively proved. The weapons of mass destruction is the famous thing that even ruined the reputation of one of our best generals. He was the main general during the Bush Jr. administration.
Was it the black guy?
Yep. And they asked him to go. And he had a great reputation all the way up until that point. And they asked him to go to the UN and lie to the UN to say that there's weapons of mass destruction based on really, really weak evidence, and it's totally proved to be completely false. So
yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. His in 5 minutes we'll be talking about something else, and we'll think of his name.
We'll remember his name in 5 minutes. I can look it up, but but I'll look it up in a minute. But the interesting thing about that too is that what I found fascinating is reports that came out, data reports that were classified that came out after 9/11 and everything, showed that our CIA people in Iraq at the time were begging the State Department not to invade. They were saying, please don't do this. You're going to destroy the entire structure of this, and it's going to cause a whole bunch of shit. We know that the Al-Qaeda and the Salafis have power in certain areas. If you take Saddam out, it's going to allow these to proliferate, and they sure as shit did as soon as we did that. So total disaster. Actual CIA people who actually lived there and worked there on the ground said, do not do this. And the State Department arrogantly was like, no, we got this. It's fine. We're going to bring peace to them. Even though there hasn't been in Iraq for centuries, we'll do it in less than 10 years. That's the kind of arrogance that happens sometimes. That I wish America was wiser with that stuff sometimes.
So that is consistent with some things that I've heard from former military contractors, former SEALs, former just people who were like in Baghdad in Iraq before we invaded in 2003. 2002?
2003, yep.
And they were saying that it was a lively, fun place. It was like a Las Vegas where there was an economy, there was a nightlife, there was people. It was normal. It wasn't how we think of today as this desert, war-ridden, terrorist-ridden place.
Yes.
So yeah, that's
It's one of those that
there's
never
consistency coming out now that we fucked up. We shouldn't have done that.
I think so, yeah. And the history books, I look at it in that long term and seeing what are the history books going to say 100 years from now? And that's going to be one that was a major strategic blunder while America was in its unipolar era. So it's like we're in that era where for a while, just for a short couple decades, we were a superpower unmatched. No one was even close. And during that time was that. And we just made a huge, silly error in that. And you really can't, like I said, the hard part I have with is I can't see the justification. If you remove the weapons of mass destruction, which again, a lot of those CIA reports said that was scant at best. It said that they were trying to do so, trying to refine uranium. But they had even said in the reports that were declassified that Israel jets destroyed the plants with strikes. that they were refining the uranium at. So they were dead in the water in terms of making a nuke, basically. And so the reason we went in there is just hard to justify. And, I don't like to go into conspiracies, but you can't help but wonder, was it a feeling of Bush Sr. finishing the job from the first Gulf War? And, that makes some logical sense, but that's completely unjustifiable for all the havoc and blood and treasure that we poured into it. Because even the blood that we poured into it is nothing compared to the treasure. I mean, trillions of dollars poured into Iraq. And the worst part is there's a good example of this in history where it's useful and where it's not useful. So after World War II, we bombed Japan and Germany far into more ruins than Iraq ever was during our invasion of Iraq. Japan and Germany there's pictures of it, and their cities are just an absolute ruin. They're totally destroyed. And so we did the Marshall Plan after World War II, and the Marshall Plan literally paid for their reconstruction. So that was the same idea for Iraq. And the difference is, though, is the people of Germany and Japan wanted to rebuild their land, and they took that money and built it up into the third and fourth largest economies in the world using our money, essentially. Of course, they got their own economies going eventually, but we had bombed them so into ruin that if they had to rebuild from their own, that would have taken much longer. Their economies would have been much weaker, etc. So that is a case where American foreign aid actually made a huge impact to boost our allies. And now Japan and Germany are third and fourth largest economies in the world, one of the most peaceful and stable areas, and also anchors in the world against Russia in the west and China in the east. So we've built strategic assets, essentially, with our foreign aid money. Iraq, though, we poured, I believe, adjusted for inflation, more money into Iraq. Yeah. And because of that, the warlords literally have palaces and shit all over, from Qatar to Abu Dhabi. They have shit all over, and they got super rich and had a wonderful time. But Iraq is still a ruined mess, and the people still suffer. And if anything, it's worse than when Saddam was there. So where all that money went.
Didn't we get a return on our investment of rebuilding Japan and Germany? But yet we're out trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Correct. And the difference is you really had to know the history of the countries. And Iraq is really two countries that are split into Sunni and Shia, and both of an Arab and a Persianized half. It's not really a full country. And, like I said, the CIA guys are saying, like, it's not going to be like Germany. It's not going to be like Japan. So, yeah, it's one of those, What's Winston doing?
He puts his head under my blinds so I can't see. I think there's a delivery or some sort.
He's chasing off the mailman.
Exactly.
Nice. Oh yeah, I do miss the dog. Dogs are a great. Humans spent 10,000 plus years building a bond with dogs, so it's like humans and dogs, man, all the way.
Close the door.
Cats is a different thing. I mean, we have a bond with them, but they really don't need us. For a lot of times, dogs and man was like, we depended on each other to survive in certain areas. So that was there's like a bond there that's unlike any other animal, I'd say. But yeah, the aspects of Saddam is actually fascinating because he was so painted as a villain here that if you start to go into it and you realize what's going on, like it's so crazy and so complicated and layered. That's not to say I'm not going to sugarcoat or make any excuses for Saddam and the Baathists at all. They were utterly ruthless to the Shiite that they dominated. They were, and not just the Shiite, anyone that even and there's stories like anyone even remotely said the wrong thing at a meeting got shot and executed the next day. Like, it's just so classic worthless dictator bullshit. But in a country that's broken already, he was holding it together out of fear and stuff. That it did have an economy, like those guys were saying, special forces and stuff. There was a functioning society somewhat, despite it being held together by fear of the dictator. It was at least something. Now it's just a broken ruin, more or less. And that was after, it's a broken ruin after we poured a $4 trillion or whatever the amount is into it. So the thing about this frustrating is, again, first, why I removed him, but also there's some smart people in the CIA, in the State Department, stuff like that. The fact that they didn't know Iraq's history enough to know exactly what they were buying is, you are going to buy a Germany, which is largely ethnically homogeneous, largely the same religion. Japan, same exact thing. Rebuilding those kind of countries with aid money is way, way easier than it is in a country that's basically split within itself and can't really function as it is. And that's going to take decades of leadership. If we were planning to stay there, like I was going to say many times, if we're going to go to Iraq, the only way it's going to work, we stay for like 50 to 100 years. And of course, everyone thought that was ridiculous, and it was, we left in like 10 years, or 20 years. But I mean, if you're going to build a project like a nation building, that's a nation that's that broken, you can't just show up and bomb everything and leave. You're not going to fix anything. And you're going to literally have to be daddy for like 50 years until everyone figures it out to be adults themselves and figures it out. But until then, you just have tribal warlords that are trying to get one up on each other. And that's pretty much what Iraq is right now, is Shiite militias versus Sunni militias versus the federal government. And the federal government is often the weaker partner in the three. So the weaker of the three. So that works out good for them.
So at what point do we say that, Dwight Eisenhower was correct in that we should fear the military-industrial complex, and then you have Julian Assange talking about how we would use these wars merely to funnel money and then take money. What is that called? We're essentially just washing money from one hand to another hand by spending these trillions of dollars, keeping them in, keeping their profits flowing there just throughout, our entire lifetimes.
Definitely a case to be made for that. One that was going around a lot when the war first happened in a few years after the main 2003 to 2006 was that it was all for Iraq's oil money. And of course, as we've talked about before, our dependence on foreign oil has only decreased as the years have gone by. So we don't depend more on Saudi and Iraqi oil. We depend less on it. We actually do fracking projects that rival the production here. So we can almost produce enough for ourselves. The problem is we don't, like in a market that's traded with global markets, the Saudi and Middle Eastern oil money is still going to be a big factor for a long time, because even if we could produce our own amount, that doesn't mean that the whole rest of the world's money, prices of oil won't shoot up and affect our oil markets, because it's all connected. It's a global oil market. So even though we can produce our own, we still have to work with them to keep the prices down. Otherwise, we'll still be paying a lot more because we're all connected to the oil market. You can imagine in a free market, if we had much cheaper oil than the rest of the world, because the Saudis aren't producing, then they're going to buy our oil super cheap from us. And of course, what are we going to do? Raise our oil prices. So the whole thing is to keep the overall prices low by keeping Saudi production up. And that's one that, would really help, that I just wish I wish this country would get its shit together so much. I don't even want to hate on them. I want them to get their shit together, and that's Venezuela. Because actually the largest proven oil reserves on earth is Venezuela. And if they were producing even half as much as Saudi Arabia, this whole thing would be a whole different strategic discussion. But they've only gone downhill since the 60s. That's what's so crazy, is they were actually considered a rich and middle income country, doing well. and their production as well as their economy has only just flatlined ever since, and not flatlined, but just declined. And it's just thanks to socialist policies, and perfect yet another modern example why socialist forward countries are disasters. They just don't work.
But we're going to make it work in the United States because we'll do it different.
Somehow. They always say that every single time, despite the different culture, despite the different religion, despite the different part of the world. They always say that every single time, but it just doesn't ever seem to work out that way. But yeah, Venezuela would be such a strategic advantage for the West and America, and especially if they could drastically increase their oil production and put pressure on the Saudis and the Russians and others in OPEC who want to limit production as much as possible, because what does that ultimately mean for them? Higher oil prices, right? Yep. So if there was another big, it was money. If there was another big player who was actually producing in large amounts like they are, then they'd have to contend with them for the total oil market. And so anyways, but back to my point about that was that the whole thing is that we went to Iraq to take their oil. And I've never seen any definitive proof that that's been the case. Most of the refineries and factories we tried to build there were bombed by ISIS or Shia militias, or never got even remotely functional, or even at a third of the capacity they were planned for. So any idea that we just suddenly showed up with Chevron and started pumping it out of the ground is the kind of political leftist, rightist delusions that aren't based in reality, but they make for great clickbait things. There were so many articles and so many politicians and comedians using that as a one-liner on CNN or Fox News, that it was about stealing their oil. And the more accurate thing would be related to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and the companies like Halliburton that got no bid contracts. That is both less patriotic and as well as more politically contentious to admit that perhaps the advantage was to do that. With that said, it was probably one of the worst investments overall, because if it was to make these companies money, but to put the U.S. Federal budget into so much debt for that would be an extremely bad investment, no matter how you slice it. And even especially as these are U.S.-based companies, they'll have to deal with the burden of the federal deficit. So it would just it could very well be the case, but it would be absolutely horrible. It wouldn't be smart or strategic or some tricky thing that they're doing at a secret level or something. That would be an absolute blunder. It was actually a huge, vast waste of treasure that we could have allocated to building. Like, you could have done the same thing and said, you're going to build an F-25 and then had billions upon billions lost in that, than what it went to in Iraq and to pay for Halliburton no bid contracts. It was a vast, you could have done that differently, and it definitely would have had better return on both Americans' deficit, because ultimately it is the taxpayer budget that's paying for these wars, right? So what's essentially
everything.
Yeah, the Assange kind of concept is that they use federal money to pay for these military industrial companies, and that would kind of create a money was exchanging hands. And like I said, it totally could be the case. Absolutely, don't know. We don't have enough information, but it would be a horrible, horrible investment. And they could have done that other ways. Like I said, they have those bloated military programs all the time, where you find out they paid what was that one famous one where they paid such and such 1.2 million for a toilet seat or something, stuff like that. You can misallocate it in other ways instead of going to a country causing. I think it would end up being the figure is different. It goes from 350 to 500,000 people died of Iraqis, and about 5,000 Americans died. So it also is a reflection. I think we also should remind ourselves that the military itself was not incompetent. To only get 5,000 casualties in a foreign country like that is remarkable, and shows the actual ability of the military, given the constraints that were put on it. but that's like, so like the difference between like say the Russian military and why it has problems is too many of its problems where the a sergeant or a higher level up lieutenant or something will take payoff bribes using that tax money. He has a nice palace, but the artillery shells are not available because he used that money for other things. I have no evidence that I've ever seen of that with our military. Our military is actually pretty lean and mean. That's what makes it the most feared. But it's also it's just so massive in spending that it can spend so much as well. That you do have situations where they just, oh, we found we didn't spend this money and we spent way more than we should. And also that programs that really didn't have any chance of ever getting off the ground, they spent a bunch of money on anyways. So stuff like that. So they misspend money too. I'm not saying American military doesn't, but I will say when you look at the performance on the field, that's like 5,000 casualties over 10 years. That's remarkable and is actually a testament to actually how well performing the military is. Even though during that time when we were growing up, there was all these documentaries and videos talking about how terrible the American military is in Iraq and all this stuff. That made for good clickbait stuff, but it wasn't. That wasn't true. How much? What are we at with just the estimated casualties in Russia for just this war already? A couple 100,000. So that just shows an example of at least 100,000 casualties. So that just shows like the scale. Although the armies are different, it does show that to only get 5,000 over 10 years. Wow, pretty remarkable. So that's kind of a side tangent, but it certainly wasn't. It doesn't seem to be about the oil. It definitely could be about the military-industrial complex. That I will concede that it could definitely.
Using it for money laundering. That's the actual term I was looking for. And then we definitely have to make some changes with our military production, because I believe that it's either 10 to 1 or 100 to 1 of how much it costs us to make our ammunition compared to Russia. It's like Russia can make these bullets for $10. The United States charges $1,000 to make the same bullet.
For sure.
Or Russia makes it for $100 and we charge $1,000. But it's like the fact that we're running out of ammunition to supply Ukraine, supply Israel, and the fact that Russia can make the same one for 10 cents on the dollar or 1 penny on the dollar.
That's a testament to how, by all accounts, they would guess that Russia would not even still be in the war. And the fact that they are is pretty impressive. And that is because of those exact kind of figures. With that said, of course, there's a fine line. The ATAMACs, the ATMAMCs, that have vastly greater range than any of Russian's equipment, it costs a lot more for a reason, right? And that's why. And it's literally Russia has no counter to that, and that's why Ukraine wants those the most. But that's one of those examples. But like you said, like with a bullet, which is a bullet and has been manufactured since before the World Wars, that should not be costing what it costs, say, produced these days. And the ability for Russia to do that. With that said, like I said, there's missiles and weapon systems that we have that are simply better than Russia's, and they cost a lot more though. And so, where to finally tune that budget is interesting. But of course, all this does have some allocation back to the fact that we let the Rust Belt develop, and we're not making those bullets in the manufacturing hubs of the United States. We've outsourced it all to China for quick bucks, and East Asia, and now we're finding that's really difficult to get it and scale that we want, because we can't homegrown our own factories and scale them up like we did during World War II. Of course, it's well known during World War II, they literally took car and heavy machinery factories and literally switched them over to tanks and planes and stuff. Like you literally already had the capacity and you could just switch the capacity. From what I understand, it's not that easy these days because of the economic decisions that we made as a country.
There's that saying that FDR didn't win World War II. It was Ford Motor Company, because of just how much the tanks were able to produce.
For sure.
Just we were able to outproduce everybody else in the world.
For sure. There's a documentary about it's really fascinating. I'll find it and send it to you. And it was about the one time that Hitler was recorded without his knowledge. So he wasn't giving like a pre-planned speech, and he wasn't giving like a ordained political propaganda. And it was literally him on a train talking to one of his advisors. And somebody in the meeting had snuck in a recorder and was able to get away with it. And it was literally the recording is very short, but it's of Hitler saying he was shocked that he never would have thought the Americans could make so many tanks. And that was literally like they had their pre-estimates for how many tanks they could have made. We shattered it. We absolutely completely shattered it. So it was far and above that amount. And he was talking about, I can't believe they made 110 Shermans or something like that. So 110,000 Shermans. So it was like, yeah, something like that. So it was like totally bewildered and knew they were screwed because there was no way they could ever compete with those numbers. So that was the underlying thing of the discussion. But
even though the Germans had a superior tank, we were able to just produce ours, freaking bop, 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 getting those things rolling.
The T-34 on the Russian side as Soviets was actually the exact example of that as well. The Panzer, 4 through, they had their weaknesses, but on average they were better. And there was many cases where they would take out 3 to our tanks, and even more in some cases. Some famous ones like 10-1, where they got them. They got a bunch of tanks in an alley and got them all cornered and kept just shooting them, taking them out. But the T-34 was the Russian tank that was surprisingly well engineered, and also they could just stamp it out, and they just stamped out so many of them that even with the Tiger and the Elephant tanks that the Germans were coming up with, the heavier tanks they couldn't stop the wave of T-34s coming at them. So that was a crucial factor. We should really consider that in the things of now. When we're having trouble supplying just a few small countries right now. We should definitely consider that in a war with China or Russia if we have trouble just supplying some middle-range countries with enough ammunition right now. Are we going to be able to have the amount that we need later on, for sure, in case of a much bigger conflict? That's the worry I always have with China, is similar to Germany, is their better equipment allowed them to make great gains at first, but eventually they were overwhelmed. And you could see that could potentially happen with America with China, is we make some great gains at first, and then eventually their numbers, the weight of their numbers, start to move against us. And without having some manufacturing at home here, that's that makes it all the more the case. With that said, I was watching Oppenheimer recently, and I really don't we forget that amongst all these current 21st century wars, there is super nukes out there, and all the major countries have them: China, Russia, and us, and France, and the UK, and Germany doesn't, but France has plenty actually. And these are all countries with hydrogen super nukes, fusion nuclear weapons that are basically will destroy all the biggest cities in the world. Moscow, Beijing, it doesn't matter really the city. They will absolutely demolish them. And I think, what was at the last count, that America has reduced them since the Cold War, but I believe we still have about 2,000 of them. So I don't even think there's that many major world cities, as a matter of fact, in the entire world, that are massive cities that would require hydrogen bombs like that. The other ones you could just do with regular fission bombs. So you really have to wonder, how is a war with China, another world war, how's that really going to work with nuclear weapons? You could, of course, there's 2 avenues you could see, but there has been some smart scientists that have said that basically, if you do the math, it's just a matter of time before we nuke ourselves because of that probability. The longer time goes on, the greater percentage that somebody's going to use them. And so for that reason, it's just a matter of time before they get used. And I would like, of course, I would like that not to be the case. But you got to see how it would go if China or America's losing. The way to change the dynamic would be to nuke stuff. So, yeah, absolutely insane. So I really just was hoping that we would find a way to solve these problems economically through economic competition going in the future. And that was kind of the promise of a nuclear world, was that the cost of war is so insane at the nation state level between major powers that you'd have to find a way to do it. But I don't know. It depends on the person if you think we're heading towards war with China or not.
So I heard a statistic that throughout all of history, recorded history, we believe there's less than 200 years of peace. So that means in all the other time there has been war going on. And that's that we know of. Okay. So how naive are we? Not what you're saying, because you're saying is much more of a reality if you base it off historical events.
Right.
How naive is it, or how optimistic is it for us to say, how can we involve all these other major countries, China, Russia, in Middle East, the Iraqs, Irans of the world, into an economy where everybody is benefiting to reduce probability of war? Because if you look at our own country in the United States, crime usually goes down when economic flourishment is going up and everybody's making more money. There's no reason to commit more crimes.
Stuff like that, exactly.
So how realistic is it to get them involved, and is it just a ego thing amongst the people, the powers that be in our own countries and maybe their countries? Or is it just how do we come up with that solution, and what is the viability?
For sure. Yeah. Russia's the great example of that. And it's both in both ways. So after the bitterness of the Cold War, the Americans couldn't help but gloat, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they couldn't help but really treat Russia as, you're now third rate and you don't count, and try to write them off at every advantage. Instead of embracing them into the European community, into Western Europe, and saying, look, you're part of the group now and join with us, they largely said, well, you're no longer an issue, so you go do whatever you're going to do out there, and good luck. And that was the worst strategic thing we could have done. We could have embraced them and said, become more part of the West, become more trade interlinked with us, and your economy would flourish. With that said, of course, that's the issue I always struggle with former Soviet Union countries in Eastern Europe, is they have the economy, they're part of the EU, they got the resources, but their output compared to Western Europe countries is always significantly lower. And it's actually, from what I've seen, as far as I can tell, if socialism teaches a culture, and that national culture is what has to be eradicated, and that's not something you can just remove by saying the Soviet Union's over or saying that we have a new government. These are cultural habits that you literally don't spend the same. You literally do different things with what you do spend. There's lots of nepotism, where often the factory owner, instead of going for most efficiency, is looking for a handout. And these kind of things that you teach.
It's the Indian reservation concept, where we have created a culture, not a culture that they had previously, but we've created a culture through the reservations of socialism that doesn't actually promote anyone trying to move forward and create a greater economy, flourishment within that culture.
Because of the injustices of the past, there's a lot of things that already are in many ways economically gained for their advantage if they were able and willing to take advantage of it. And you could see a few tribes are doing that. Like there's a tribe in the south, I think, and they have a lot of oil on their land and stuff. And man, they're all going to college and stuff like that, and they're educating, going to STEM degrees and stuff like that. It's very impressive. But you're not seeing that enough on the reservations, even though they have federal funding. They got all these kind of programs that could, in many ways, accelerate their development. And so that's that part that we never talk about when we're talking about politics and stuff, is because it stabs at something that's emotionally tender for people, and that's the culture of things. And Eastern Europe is, to me, that classic example. Countries like Bulgaria and Hungary and stuff, they by all rights should be flourishing. But because of the remnants of communist behavior that was forced and taught upon them for many generations, they just can't seem to shake like the factory owner getting payouts instead of going for maximum output. They just can't seem to shake that, and so Russia couldn't shake that either. And since Russia couldn't shake that either, Putin had to come in and do what he could do and keep the economy going and keep it afloat. We often forget that under Yeltsin, this thing was nosediving. Like the value of their ruble was just absolutely cratering. So the whole thing, irrespective, West is doing its own thing at this time. It's got all its own stuff going on. It's like, ooh, we're number one. We're like, whoever, this is the 90s. It's like glory days for America. They're not even concerned with what's happening in Russia. Chechnya wars were absolutely bloody. And if we were concerned, we would have done something about that. But we weren't concerned. So, but during that time, Russia on its own, the ruble was just collapsing, going through the roof. And so Putin had to take control and was appointed later on and, ran for president and did all his whole story. The difficult thing is you still have to wonder, like Saddam today, if Russia wanted to join up on an economic way and say, why don't we open the floodgates of trade between the EU and us, and actually we get our shit together and institute structural changes instead of the factory owner getting payouts? He gets huge fines for that, et cetera, where too often we have what's called the oligarchs in Russia. These guys are basically incentivized to take payouts instead of market efficiency. But if they did reform it, which would be fantastic because Russia's a huge nation with huge resources, then the EU trade would be vast. I mean, that'd be the EU and Russia trade would be just like boom, dude. That whole region would be booming. Like you said, crime would be down. All those economic, figures would be in the green. And you have to wonder, like, why isn't the focus of the Russian state on that instead of trying to take another part of land to the west of it? I understand, like, somewhat the political aspects of it, but if their economy was dynamic, Ukraine would be the least of their concerns. They would have literally no strategic reason to take Ukraine and need to create this war between NATO and this battlefield borderline between NATO and Russia. Instead, it could actually be a huge trade dynamic. I would say it's more the failure of the Russian state and not the state, really the people too, to not get the dynamic economy going. And because there's no dynamic economy going besides oil, Putin has limited options to keep his the strength of the state alive, and one of them is to do this Ukraine thing. But it's one of those classic examples to me where you could take another route, and it would be, in my mind, much more powerful for Russia, the country, to get a dynamic economy, trade with the EU, huge market in the EU, and you have this vast amount of Eurasian trade going on right there. That would be, I mean, that's what we've all hoped for. I mean, people like me, since the Cold War, since the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, I've wanted to see that, because then Eurasia, Europe, and Central Asia and stuff would only be a great counterweight, much stronger counterweight to China or anybody else who wanted to get wily with America. So yeah, it's just unfortunate that it played out the way it did. I don't put it all on Putin's shoulders, though. It's things like I said, like the culture of Russia and the Soviet Union. You go, there's the famous stories where you go down a Russian street and all of a sudden the police have a checkpoint, and the police just need 20 rubles to get past the checkpoint. There's no fixing the roads. It doesn't go to a tax fund. It goes to that police department's pocket, usually the head leader of the police department, and then he trickles down a little bit to the other guys as well. These kind of nepotism structures don't make the system more efficient, and in fact suck away a lot of market growth that could otherwise. That $20 could be for him to buy a new phone or something, a new Apple iPhone or a new Russian made tech device, stuff like that. Shit that we consume in America just by the shit tons. Imagine if a bunch of that extra consumer cash was sucked away into frivolous and not market efficient ways, and that's where that is unfortunate. And I don't want to see that. I don't gloat that Russia's in that position. I would like to see them thrive, and it's just unfortunate that they aren't. And yeah, Ukraine wouldn't even be a blip on the radar. Ukraine's economy and population is so small compared to Russia's that it wouldn't even, if Russia had a dynamic economy with flourishing trade with the EU, Ukraine wouldn't even be a factor. In fact, it would just further help boost that trade between the two. Yeah. So it wouldn't even be what it is right now. The dynamic would be completely different.
Yeah. Well, let's cap it off right there.
For sure.
And let's get back to it in a couple of days.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, indeed. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Russian thing. Next time
we're going to go Russia part 2.
Russia part 2.
We're going to go Russia part 2. This is going to be a 2-parter.
For sure.
I'll text you and we'll figure out a day to do part 2 on this, and then wherever it goes from there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hope, like I said, I hope the best for Russia. It's often become politicized on Democrat and Republican, whether you're like for or against them and stuff. That's hella foolish. It
doesn't make sense to me, that part. So
it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I want to do a part 2 on this because I have a lot to say about the Russia situation, but sure. I don't think it needs to be politicized in our country. That I think is where we're going wrong.
Correct. I agree. And it's like Iraq. You really need to know the history of the country before you tangle with them. And I think that was the real error we made with America. There was clearly, based on what happened, a lot of people here did not understand that country. They didn't know the history of it. They didn't understand what they were getting into. And we paid a very high cost in blood and treasure for that. And we could potentially be doing the same with Russia. We should educate our fellow Americans about Russian history, about how things went wrong with the Soviet Union, what it's actually like now, and different alternative histories on where it could go differently. Like I said, with the EU and the expanded trade, that's an alternate history. There's no reason why it couldn't happen. There's zero reasons why it couldn't happen.
We'll have to send this episode and part 2 to your dad.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes, that's where it has it's become politicized. Those kind of things, and it doesn't make sense to politicize something like that. It doesn't make any sense. So it's an interesting thing. But Iraq and Russia have similar things that we have involved ourselves into. But I do want to just cap it off with. There's also an example where foreign aid is not always bad. Japan and Germany are the quintessential examples of what happens if we spend our money strategically and smartly. We actually gain strengths instead of lose strength. But you're right. But it's absolutely true with the current, Vivek-based concept of foreign aid, where if we're just misspending it and going onto wild adventures and it doesn't have strategic, smart advantages, then that doesn't help anything either. In fact, just helps our deficit grow.
Yeah. So, which is not good for us American people.
No.
All right,
no. Sounds good.
I'm going to hop off. I'll shoot you a text and we'll plan the follow-up.
Sounds good. Sounds like a plan. How's that fast going?
Dude, I'm on day 4 right now, and so I'm probably not as sharp as normal, but I still got like 2.5 days to go.
Yeah, it seems fine, man. It seems fine. Yeah, so, wow. Impressive.
I feel I definitely have a little brain fog. There were some things and some names.
For sure.
I'm like, what is this? What is this? What is this? But no, the next one. Yeah, I want to do part 2 with the Russia, and I'll make sure I'm sharper, and I'll have some things looked up that I want to bring out.
Sounds good. Sounds like a plan. Well, I'm going to be doing a 3-day at least coming up here, so I'll try to time it so I don't have as much brain fog.
Yeah, no, let me know.
Peace, Toby.
All right, I'll see you.
Peace, bro.